Across the galaxy, the apex species of the Orion spur treated even minor cuts with near-religious life-saving ceremony. Consequently, when a kinetic slug tore a grapefruit-sized hole through Jack's side, Queen Isabella anticipated an immediate, dignified death. His calm request for a stapler and duct tape, however, shattered her composure and signaled a seismic shift in the future of interstellar politics. There is a specific kind of boredom reserved for infantrymen assigned to diplomatic security. It's a boredom that aches in the lower back, settles into the arches of the feet, and makes one acutely aware of how much a dress collar is chafing their neck. Jack was standing at parade rest by a pillar that looked like it was made of sponge sugar. The locals called it ether glass. It was completely structurally sound, supposedly, but leaning against it felt like a gamble he wasn't willing to take. They were on Prime, the home world of the Sovereign Assembly. The architects here didn't believe in right angles or concrete. Everything was sweeping arches, bioluminescent flora, and crystalline spires that caught the light of their twin suns and turned the Capitol into a blinding prism. It was beautiful. It was also a tactical nightmare. There was no cover. The walls were transparent. "You look like you're trying to swallow a lemon, Jack," a voice muttered over his internal qualms. Jack didn't move his head. He just shifted his eyes slightly toward the balcony where Simon was posted with the Overwatch rifle. "If I have to stand here for another hour listening to these politicians argue over trade tariffs on agricultural paste, I'm going to throw myself off this balcony. Simon, I swear to God, just smile and nod, man. We're getting hazard pay for this. It's not hazard pay if the biggest threat is dying of old age." In the center of the grand hall, Queen Isabella was holding court. She was the matriarch of the Tauran and Concordant. To strictly adhere to assembly guidelines, the humans used translated names for their dignitaries, a necessary evil because attempting to pronounce their actual names usually resulted in torn vocal cords. Isabella was tall, nearly 7 feet, and possessed a fragile, lethal grace. Her skin was a translucent, pearlescent white, revealing the faint, rhythmic glow of the pale blue fluid that served as her blood. The Taurans were an elegant species. They were brilliant diplomats, unparalleled artists, and absolute cowards when it came to physical confrontation. Their biology was highly advanced, but deeply flawed by human standards. Their nervous systems were so interconnected, so hypersensitive that a moderate physical trauma would cause a cascading neurological failure. If you punched a Tauran in the face, you didn't just break their nose. Their brain panicked, shut down the organs to prevent further pain, and they died of systemic shock. They evolved in a garden. Humanity evolved in a meat grinder. The summit was dragging into its 4th hour. The human delegation, led by Ambassador Carter, was pushing for a mutual defense pact. The Taurans were hesitating. They found humans crude. They found humanity's history of industrialized warfare barbaric. They wanted human guns, but they didn't want to shake the hands that held them. Then the reinforced ether glass ceiling shattered. It wasn't a crack. It was a localized high sonic detonation that turned 100 square meters of hardened crystal into microscopic shrapnel. The sound hit first, a physical wall of pressure that ruptured the drums of half the alien dignitaries in the room. Jack felt blood trickle down his neck as his own ears popped, a high-pitched ringing drowning out the immediate screams. He dropped to a knee, instincts honed in the mud of the outer rim. Colonial wars taking over. Figures dropped through the breach. 6 of them. They were wearing heavy, unmarked hard suits, equipped with kinetic dampeners and holding magnetic accelerator rifles. Mercenaries, and they weren't here to take hostages. The first volley of fire cut through the center of the room. A Turan minister to the left of the Queen took a glancing round to the shoulder. The kinetic energy spun him around. In a human, it would be a shattered collarbone and a lot of screaming. The minister hit the floor, twitched once as his nervous system overloaded from the localized trauma, and died before he even registered the pain. Contact. Ceiling breach. Center mass. Jack barked into his calms, drawing the heavy tungsten-loaded sidearm from his hip. "I see them," Simon yelled over the static. His rifle cracked from the balcony, a deep rhythmic thud. One of the mercenaries jerked backward, a fist-sized crater opening in his chest plate. Jack didn't wait to watch him fall. His assignment was the Queen. He pushed off the marble floor, sprinting across the open ground. The air was thick with the smell of ozone and vaporized copper. Energy weapons flashed, singing the air. But these guys were using old-school slugs, heavy, brutal, and utterly devastating to the fragile aliens in the room. Isabella was frozen. Her honor guard, 2 towering Turans with ceremonial pikes, were already dead, their bodies untouched, but their nervous systems fried by the proximity of the sonic blast. Jack tackled her. It wasn't polite, and it certainly wasn't protocol. He hit her at waist height, his shoulder driving into her midsection, taking them both down behind the heavy gilded podium, just as a line of heavy caliber rounds chewed through the floor where she had been standing. "Stay down," he roared, grabbing the back of her ceremonial collar to keep her head glued to the floor. She looked at him, her large, multifaceted eyes wide with a terror so pure it almost looked synthetic. Her pale blue circulatory system was pulsing frantically just beneath her skin. They are killing us," she whispered, her translation collar delivering the words in a flat, mechanical deadpan that completely contrasted her absolute panic. "Yeah, that's generally how assassinations work, Your Majesty," Jack grunted, popping out from the side of the podium. He fired 3 rounds. The heavy recoil of the pistol snapped his wrists back. The rounds pinged uselessly off the lead mercenary's shielding. "Simon, I need suppressing fire. I'm moving the package to the east corridor." "I'm pinned, Jack. They've got heavy repeaters on the balcony." Static cut Seaman off, then a wet crunch, then silence. Jack cursed, dropping the magazine and slamming a fresh one home. The remaining 5 mercenaries were advancing, fanning out to flank the podium. They weren't rushing. They were methodical. They knew exactly how fragile everyone in this room was. "Can you run?" he asked the Queen, glancing down at her. She was trembling. A fine, violent tremor shook her entire frame. "My legs, the sonic pressure. I cannot feel my lower extremities. Fear paralysis." Her brain was already beginning to lock her body down to protect her from the sensory overload of the battle. If he left her here, she would die of a heart attack before the mercenaries even shot her. Right. Change of plans. Jack grabbed her arm and hauled her up. She weighed practically nothing. Maybe 90 pounds of hollow bones and light muscle. He threw her arm over his shoulder. keeping his body between her and the advancing line of fire. "We're taking a walk. Do not look back." They broke cover, making a desperate sprint for the arched doorway leading to the service corridors. The grand hall was a slaughterhouse. Dozens of alien dignitaries lay motionless on the floor. Some had been hit, but most had simply succumbed to the concussive force of the weapons being fired. Their bodies had betrayed them. Jack dragged Isabella, firing blindly behind him to keep the mercenaries' heads down. The marble floor was slick with a myriad of different colored blood. Blue, green, a sickly translucent yellow. 10 meters, he shouted, mostly to keep himself focused. Just 10 meters. Keep moving. The door was heavy reinforced oak, a gift from the human delegation. A decade ago. Finally, something in this damn palace that could stop a bullet. He shoved the queen forward, throwing her through the threshold. As Jack turned to follow her, the world stopped. It didn't happen in slow motion. That's a myth they sell in the vids. It happened in a fraction of a microsecond. A heavy kinetic round, likely a depleted uranium slug from a magnetic accelerator, caught him in the right side. It didn't punch through cleanly. It hit the hardened ceramic plate of his tactical vest, shattered it, and carried the jagged shrapnel of his own armor straight into his obliques. The impact picked his 200-pound frame up entirely off the floor and threw him through the doorway. Jack hit the far wall of the corridor hard, sliding down and leaving a thick, wet smear of crimson against the pristine white wallpaper. For 3 seconds there was no pain. There was just an intense, suffocating pressure like a truck had parked on his chest, followed by a profound, terrifying cold. He looked down. His dress uniform was gone on the right side. The armor was pulverized. There was a jagged, ragged hole just above his hip. It was about the size of a fist. He could see the torn edges of his muscle tissue, the shattered white fragment of his floating rib, and the dark, angry welling of blood that was instantly soaking through his pants and pooling on the floor. It was a bad hit. The kind of hit you look at and immediately understand you aren't walking away from. He blinked, the ringing in his ears returning with a vengeance. His vision swam, the edges turning dark and fuzzy. Get up. The thought wasn't rational. It was the primal lizard brain response of an organism that fundamentally refused to die. His adrenal glands, practically dormant, compared to what they were about to do, dumped a massive toxic cocktail of epinephrine and cortisol directly into his bloodstream. Directly into his bloodstream. The cold vanished. The pain arrived. It felt like someone had shoved a branding iron into his side and was slowly twisting it. Jack let out a sharp, ragged hiss through his teeth, gripping the edges of the wound with his left hand, applying immediate brutal pressure. The blood was warm and slick. Across the hall, Queen Isabella was staring at him. She had pushed herself up onto her elbows. Her multi-setted eyes were locked onto his side. The translation collar around her neck let out a soft digital chirp. You are ruptured." The mechanical voice conveyed no emotion, but her physical reaction was violent. The pale blue glow beneath her skin began to flicker and dim. She was watching him die, and the empathic shock was triggering her own nervous system to begin its shut-down sequence. "I'm fine," Jack lied, his voice a growly, wet rasp. He planted his left boot on the ground and pushed the sheer agony of engaging his core muscles nearly blacked him out. His vision inverted for a second, colors flashing negative, but he forced his eyes open. He leaned heavily against the wall, leaving another smear of blood as he dragged himself up to a standing position. Isabella recoiled, pressing herself against the opposite wall. "Do not stand. Your central neurological pathways have been severed. Your circulatory pressure is compromising. You must lay flat and embrace the end." "Not really my style, Queenie," he grunted. He unclipped the heavy blast door remote from his belt with trembling, blood-slicked fingers and slammed the close button. With a heavy hydraulic hiss, the thick oak and steel-reinforced doors slammed shut, locking the grand hall away. A second later, a deafening thud rattled the frame as heavy rounds impacted the other side. They would hold for a few minutes at least. "Come on," Jack said, looking down at her. He extended his left hand. His right was currently busy holding his intestines inside his body. She didn't take his hand. She just stared at the blood dripping rapidly from his side, pooling around his boots. "You are dead. The trauma, it is incompatible with biology. Why are you not ceasing function?" "Because I don't have time to bleed," he growled, quoting an old flat-screen movie his dad used to watch. He didn't wait for her. He reached down, grabbed the scruff of her elaborate robes, and hauled her to her feet. "Move down the hall. The safe room is 3 levels down. Move." He gave her a shove. She stumbled, looking back at him as if he was a ghost, haunting his own corpse. But she started walking. Every step was a negotiation with gravity and consciousness. His heart was beating so hard it felt like it was going to crack his sternum. The human body is a miraculous, terrifying machine. When a Tehran takes damage, their body accepts defeat to spare them pain. When a human takes damage, the brain suppresses the pain, narrows the vision, and turns the body into a localized engine of pure, unadulterated spite. Jack checked his heavy pistol. 4 rounds left in the mag. 3 spare mags on his belt. Should be enough, he thought, spitting a glob of metallic-tasting saliva onto the pristine floor. Just got to keep the blood on the inside. They made it into a maintenance alcove halfway down the corridor, just as the heavy doors at the far end began to groan under the stress of a thermal cutting torch. The mercenaries were burning their way through. The alcove was tight, smelling faintly of ozone and industrial cleaner. It was a dead end, but it had a heavy security grating they pulled shut behind them. It bought them time. Not much, but enough. Jack slumped against a conduit pipe, sliding down to the metal grate floor. He couldn't hold it anymore. The adrenaline peak was cresting, and the inevitable crash was waiting on the other side. If he didn't stop the bleeding now, he was going to bleed out in less than 3 minutes. Jack Riley. Isabella spoke his name haltingly, standing as far away from him as the cramped space allowed. The ambient light in the alcove cast deep shadows across her translucent face. She looked genuinely sick. "Your fluid loss is catastrophic. The red substance, it is everywhere." "Yeah, we call it blood." "It's messy," Jack muttered, his breathing coming in short, ragged gasps. He reached around to the small of his back with his good hand and unclipped his IFAC individual first aid kit. He dragged it into his lap and ripped the Velcro open with his teeth. "What are you attempting?" she asked, stepping slightly closer. a morbid curiosity fighting through her biological revulsion. There is no stasis pod here, no regenerative matrix. You cannot survive this tissue deficit. Watch me. Jack pulled out a heavy trauma dressing, a vial of coagulation stems, and a canister of combat biofoam. The biofoam was nasty stuff. It was essentially a rapidly expanding, self-cauterizing polyurethane that filled a wound cavity, stopped the bleeding, and glued the tissue together. It also burned like the fires of hell when applied. He looked at the hole in his side. It was worse than he thought. The bleeding was arterial. A bright, pulsing rhythm of blood was squirting weakly against his fingers. "You might want to look away for this, Your Majesty," Jack warned her, his voice tight. He uncapped the biofoam canister. He took a deep breath, mentally preparing for what he was about to do. He didn't have time to be gentle. He jammed the nozzle directly into the wound cavity. Isabella gasped. Jack pressed the trigger. The foam deployed with a loud hiss. The immediate sensation was an intense, searing heat, as if someone had poured boiling acid directly into his open nerves. The foam rapidly expanded, filling the void in his flesh, pushing against his internal organs, and hardening instantly. It cauterized the torn blood vessels on contact. A low, guttural roar tore its way out of his throat. He couldn't stop it. His vision went entirely white. His hands cramped, his jaw locking so tight he felt a tooth crack under the pressure. He dropped the canister, his hands flying up to grip his own hair as his body arched backward against the wall. Every single nerve ending screaming in absolute, unmitigated agony. It lasted for 10 seconds. 10 seconds of pure, agonizing fire. Then the foam set. The bleeding stopped. The burning faded to a dull, throbbing ache that radiated through his entire right side. Jack slumped forward, panting heavily, sweat pouring down his face, stinging his eyes. He was trembling so violently the conduit pipe rattled against the wall. Isabella was staring at him. Her pale blue skin was entirely devoid of its glow. She was quite literally pale. She had pressed herself as tightly into the corner as she could, her hands covering her mouth. You attacked yourself," she whispered, horrified. "You introduced a corrosive agent into your own internal cavity. The pain, I could sense the pain. It should have stopped your heart. It should have shattered your mind." Jack let out a weak, humorless laugh, wiping a mix of sweat and blood from his forehead with the back of his wrist. He grabbed the trauma dressing and slapped it over the hardened foam, wrapping the heavy elastic bandage around his waist to secure it. He pulled it tight, wincing as it compressed the broken rib. "It's called first aid, Isabella," Jack managed to say, his breathing slowly returning to a semi-normal rhythm. He grabbed the auto-injector of coagulation stems and slammed it into his thigh. The rush of cold drugs hit his system a second later, clearing the lingering fuzziness from his brain. "It is barbarism," she countered, her voice shaking. "Your biology, it is broken. It ignores the fundamental laws of self-preservation. When the body is destroyed, it is meant to surrender. Where I'm from, surrendering usually just means you die slower," he grunted. He grabbed the conduit pipe and hauled himself back to his feet. His right leg felt heavy, and a deep numbness was setting into his toes, but his core was stable. The biofoam was holding. "My body isn't broken, Queenie. It just has different priorities." He checked his weapon again, racking the slide to ensure a round was chambered. Now, Jack looked at her, his eyes locking onto her wide, terrified, moisture-setted gaze. The mercenaries are going to be through that door in about 60 seconds. They are going to sweep this corridor. If we stay here, we die. If we move, we might live. She looked at his side. The heavy bandage was already stained a dark, rusty brown, but the active flow of blood had ceased. She looked back up at his face. He could see the gears turning in her head. A deeply ingrained evolutionary world-view was fracturing right in front of her eyes. She was looking at a dead man walking, and the dead man was telling her what to do. "You are a monster," she whispered softly, the mechanical translation stripping the awe from her voice. But he could hear it underneath. "Yeah, and right now I'm your monster." Jack pointed the barrel of his pistol toward the grated door. "Stay behind me. If I tell you to run, you don't look back. You just run." The heavy oak doors at the end of the hall finally gave way with a deafening crash, blowing inward in a shower of splinters and molten slag. Heavy boots hit the tile. Shouts echoed down the corridor. Jack stepped out of the alcove, leveling his pistol. The pain was gone. There was only the objective. The corridor was a pristine, arching tunnel of pale ether glass and brushed steel. It was designed to make dignitaries feel like they were walking through a cathedral of light. Tactically, it was a fatal funnel. There was zero cover between the blown oak doors at the far end and the maintenance alcove where he stood. 4 mercenaries poured through the shattered threshold, their boots crunching on the debris. They moved with a terrifying synchronized efficiency. 2 took a kneeling position, their magnetic accelerator rifles scanning the dust cloud, while the other 2 advanced, hugging the walls. They wore matte gray hard suits with fully enclosed helmets, the polarized visors hiding their faces. They expected to find a corridor full of dead or dying tones. They didn't expect a human infantryman running on pure adrenaline and spite. Jack didn't aim at them. At this range, his heavy tungsten sidearm wouldn't reliably punch through their reinforced chest plates, and he only had 4 rounds left in the current magazine. Instead, he aimed upward. The vated ceiling was lined with thick, pressurized coolant pipes that fed the bioluminescent flora woven into the architecture. They were carrying a liquid nitrogen composite. Jack fired 3 times. Crack, crack. The heavy slugs tore through the ceiling panels and shattered the primary coolant junction directly above the advancing point men. The result was instantaneous and chaotic. A massive geyser of freezing pressurized vapor erupted from the ceiling, dumping thousands of gallons of sub-zero fog directly into the corridor. The ambient temperature plummeted in a matter of seconds. The thick white vapor hit the floor and billowed outward, instantly blinding their thermal optics. The advanced sensory equipment in their helmets couldn't process the sudden, overwhelming white out of supercooled gas. "Contact!" One of them shouted, his voice muffled by his helmet and the hissing roar of the escaping vapor. They fired blindly into the fog, the heavy thud of their accelerators tearing chunks of masonry from the walls. Jack dropped to a crouch, his right side screaming in protest as the hardened bow foam ground against his internal organs. He grabbed Isabella's robes with his free hand. "Stay low and do not make a sound," he hissed into her ear. He left her in the relative safety of the alcove shadow and pushed himself forward, diving straight into the rolling bank of freezing fog. The cold bit into his face, frosting his eyelashes and stealing the breath from his lungs, but it was exactly what he needed. It masked his heat signature. He moved with a low, predatory crouch, relying entirely on his hearing. The mercenaries were communicating via short-range tactical clicks, but the heavy thud of their boots on the marble floor betrayed them. A shadow materialized in the white, out less than 3 feet to his left. The mercenary was sweeping his rifle back and forth, trying to reacquire a target through the thermal bloom. Jack didn't shoot him. Gunfire would give away his position to the others. He lunged, leading with his empty left hand. He grabbed the hot barrel of the mercenary's accelerator rifle, wrenching it upward and away from his body. The sudden, violent motion caught the man completely off guard. With his right hand, Jack brought the heavy steel-framed butt of his pistol down in a brutal, sweeping arc, smashing it directly into the side of the helmet. The hard-suit helmet was designed to stop shrapnel, but it wasn't designed to completely negate blunt force trauma. The impact cracked the polarized visor. The mercenary staggered, his hands flailing. Jack swept his legs out from under him with a sharp kick to his knee joint, dropping him hard onto his back. Before the man could raise an alarm, Jack dropped his full weight onto the armored chest, ignoring the sickening pop from his own broken rib, and drove the heel of his boot into the throat guard. It crunched. The mercenary thrashed for a second, then went still. Jack immediately stripped the accelerator rifle from the dead man's grip and unclipped 2 heavy magazines from his chest rig, stuffing them into his pockets. He checked the rifle's readout. 30 rounds of depleted uranium slugs. Fully charged battery. Now we're talking. The remaining 3 mercenaries had realized their point man was down. The hissing of the coolant pipe was beginning to fade as the automated systems clamped the ruptured line. The fog was thinning. Bravo 2 is down. Sweeping left. A voice barked. Jack didn't wait for the fog to clear. He brought the heavy rifle up, bracing the stock against his left shoulder to protect his wounded right side. He stepped out of the thinning vapor, leveling the weapon at the 2 kneeling mercenaries at the far end of the hall. He squeezed the trigger. The weapon didn't kick like a traditional firearm. It hummed with violent electromagnetic force. A stream of hypersonic slugs tore down the corridor. The armor-piercing rounds shredded through their chest plates like wet paper. Both mercenaries were thrown backward, their suits sparking as the internal dampeners failed catastrophically. The last mercenary panicked. He realized he wasn't fighting a fragile pacifist alien. He broke from the wall, raising his weapon to fire a frantic burst in Jack's direction. A slug grazed Jack's left shoulder, slicing a shallow groove through his deltoid. He didn't even feel it. The adrenaline was a thick, buzzing static in his brain. Jack shifted his aim, tracked the man's movement, and put a 3-round burst directly through his center of mass. The mercenary hit the floor, sliding a few feet before coming to a stop against the base of a pristine ether glass pillar. Silence descended on the corridor, broken only by the ragged, heavy sound of Jack's own breathing. He lowered the rifle, his hand shaking violently. The adrenaline peak was finally breaking, and the sheer, unadulterated trauma of his injuries was rushing in to fill the void. He leaned heavily against the wall, sliding down slightly as a wave of intense nausea hit him. Behind him, the grate of the alcove slowly creaked open. Queen Isabella stepped out. She didn't look at the dead mercenaries. She looked exclusively at Jack. "You killed them," she stated. It wasn't an accusation. It was a statement of profound existential disbelief. They were armored. They possessed superior firepower. And you? You are currently experiencing multi-system organ failure. Rumors of my demise. Jack gasped, spitting a mouthful of blood onto the floor. Have been greatly exaggerated. He pushed himself off the wall, using the heavy rifle as a crutch. We need to keep moving. They'll send a cleanup crew when these guys miss their check-in. The primary elevators were offline, locked down by the palace security grid. That left the emergency stairwells. For a healthy human, descending 3 flights of stairs was a trivial inconvenience. For a human carrying a fist-sized chunk of hardened polymer in his abdomen, a shattered rib, and a failing circulatory system, it was Mount Everest. Every step sent a jagged shock wave of pain radiating from Jack's hip to his jaw. The bowfoam was holding his flesh together, but it was rigid. It didn't flex when he moved. It ground against his abdominal muscles and scraped against the exposed edge of his broken rib. By the time they reached the second landing, his dress uniform was completely soaked in a cold, clammy sweat. Jack stumbled, his boot catching the edge of a step. He collapsed against the handrail, coughing violently. A fresh wave of dizziness hit him, and his vision tunneled, the edges bleeding into a static-filled darkness. "Jack!" Isabella's voice cut through the ringing in his ears. He felt her long, incredibly light fingers grab his left arm, trying to steady him. It was like being supported by a bundle of hollow reeds. "I'm good. I'm good," he wheezed, squeezing his eyes shut until the dizziness receded. He leaned over the rail, taking deep, shuddering breaths. "You are not functioning nominally," Isabella said. Her translation collar conveyed a flat tone, but her multifaceted eyes were wide with genuine distress. The faint blue glow of her skin was erratic, pulsing rapidly in time with her elevated heart rate. "Your epidermis is secreting excessive moisture. Your thermal output is radiating at dangerous levels. Your body is toxic. Fever," Jack muttered. "The bowfoam has coagulants and aggressive antibiotics in it. It kicks the immune system into overdrive. It keeps you alive, but it makes you feel like you've been microwaved." She withdrew her hand, staring at him as if he were an alien artifact she couldn't comprehend. "Why do you not simply cease?" she asked. The question devoid of malice, born only of pure scientific and cultural confusion. "My species, when faced with such catastrophic structural failure, enters a peaceful stasis. The brain terminates consciousness to spare the soul from agony." "Why does your biology insist on this torture?" Jack looked at her, wiping the cold sweat from his eyes. It was a fair question. To a tone, pain was a signal to shut down. To a human, pain was an engine. "Because my ancestors didn't evolve in a garden, Isabella," he said softly, gripping the rail and forcing himself to take another step down. "We didn't have hardened scales. We didn't have venom. We weren't the fastest, and we weren't the strongest." He paused on the landing, looking at the smooth, flawless architecture of her world. "We survived by being the most stubborn things on the planet. It's called persistence hunting. A human hunter couldn't outrun a gazelle, but we could track it. We would jog after it for hours, sometimes days in the blazing heat. The animal would sprint away, rest, and then look back, and we would still be there just walking toward it. We exhausted our prey to death. We are built to endure, Queenie. Our brains are hardwired to ignore pain if it means we get to see tomorrow. She processed this, her head tilting slightly. You weaponized your own suffering. Something like that. They reached the bottom of the stairwell, pushing through the heavy fire door into the level 3 sub. The air down here was cooler, smelling of ozone and heavy machinery. The grand aesthetics of the upper floors were replaced by thick plastal bulkheads and exposed conduit. As they rounded the first corner toward the safe room approach, Jack froze. Sprawled on the floor 30 feet ahead was a human in a diplomatic security uniform. It was Davis. He had been assigned to the lower checkpoint. Jack limped forward, keeping his rifle raised, sweeping the corners. The corridor was empty. He dropped to a knee next to him, the motion tearing a fresh groan from his throat. Davis was staring blankly at the ceiling. A cluster of heavy kinetic rounds had chewed through his chest plate. He hadn't stood a chance. Isabella approached slowly, her hands clasped tightly before her. She looked down at the dead human, then looked at Jack. She expected him to mourn. She expected a ritual. Instead, Jack reached out and unclipped his tactical harness. "What are you doing?" she asked, her voice hitching. "You are desecrating the fallen." "I'm resupplying," Jack corrected her coldly, though it felt like ash in his mouth. He stripped 3 spare magazines of tungsten, slugs from Davis's belt, and checked his IFAK. He had a fresh canister of biofoam and a sealed auto-injector of combat stimulants. Jack took both, shoving them into his pockets. He grabbed Davis's heavy sidearm, checked the chamber, and tucked it into his waistband. "Davis is gone," he said, looking up at the Queen. "If I run out of ammo, we're next. He'd want me to use his gear. It's practical." "Practical?" She repeated the word as if it were a curse. "Your species views even death as a resource." "We view survival as a priority," Jack countered, pushing himself back to his feet with a heavy grunt. "Let's go. The vault is just down this hall." The safe room was located at the end of a long, reinforced steel corridor. The door itself was a massive 2 feet thick slab of solid tungsten and polyceramic composite designed to withstand a direct orbital strike. Unfortunately, it wasn't designed to stop someone who already had the codes, or in this case, someone who brought a heavy industrial thermal breaching charge. As they peered around the final corner, Jack's heart sank. 2 mercenaries were standing by the vault door. They had slapped a thick circular breaching charge directly over the primary locking mechanism. The charge was glowing a dull, angry orange, quietly eating its way through the hyperdense metal. A timer on the explosive read 45 seconds. "They are already here," Isabella whispered, the faint blue glow beneath her skin dimming significantly. She was losing hope. The biological imperative to shut down was fighting her conscious will to survive. Jack leaned back against the wall, checking his weapons. He had the stolen accelerator rifle with about 20 rounds left, Davis's sidearm, and his own nearly empty pistol. Physically, he was at the end of his rope. The edges of his vision were permanently staticky. His hands were trembling so badly, He had to grip the rifle tight enough to turn his knuckles white just to keep it steady. The fever was raging, making the corridor spin lazily around him. "Listen to me," Jack said, turning to Isabella. He didn't have the energy to be polite. He grabbed her by the shoulders. She flinched, but he held her gaze. "When I step out there, they're going to focus entirely on me. I'm going to draw their fire. You cannot survive another impact. Your structural integrity is compromised beyond repair." "Don't worry about my structural integrity," he rasped. "Worry about that door. When I engage them, you run to the keypad on the right side of the vault. I need you to punch in the emergency override sequence. Can you do that?" I am not a warrior. I am a diplomat. Right now, you're a mechanic. The code is 8802. Enter. Memorize it. 8802. Enter. She repeated automatically. "Good. Wait for my signal." Jack took a deep, shuddering breath, pulling air into his burning lungs. He closed his eyes for a fraction of a second, digging deep into the dark primal reserve of energy that humans only access when the abyss is staring back at them. Time to be the monster. Jack stepped around the corner, bringing the heavy accelerator rifle up. He didn't stop moving. A stationary target is a dead target. "Hey-ish holes," he roared, his voice raw and echoing down the plastol corridor. The two mercenaries whipped around, their weapons coming up. Jack fired on the move. The heavy electromagnetic recoil of the rifle battered his bruised shoulder. His first burst caught the mercenary on the left, chewing through his lower abdomen. The man folded in half, screaming, his weapon discharging wildly into the ceiling. The second mercenary was faster. He dropped to a knee and returned fire. The corridor erupted into a deafening exchange of hypervelocity death. Jack felt the air crack and sizzle around him as rounds clipped the walls, showering him in sparks and plastile shrapnel. A round grazed his thigh, tearing through his uniform pants and leaving a shallow burning gash, but it missed the artery. Clack! Jack's rifle jammed. The stolen weapon's battery was fine, but the feed mechanism had seized under the sustained continuous fire. The surviving mercenary saw him hesitate. He stood up, leveling his rifle perfectly at Jack's chest. Jack didn't try to clear the jam. He didn't try to draw his sidearm. He didn't have the time. He threw the 1-2 PB magnetic accelerator rifle directly at the man's face. The heavy chunk of metal and composite sailed through the air and smashed into the visor, knocking the mercenary's aim wildly off-center. His burst of fire tore into the wall directly beside Jack's head, deafening him in his left ear. Jack closed the distance. "Isabella, go!" He screamed over the ringing. He slammed into the mercenary at a full sprint. The impact was agonizing. Jack felt the bow foam in his side crack and shift, a fresh hot spike of blood welling up beneath the bandages. They went down in a tangle of limbs and armor. The mercenary was stronger than him, his hard suit enhancing his muscles, and he wasn't currently bleeding to death. He threw a brutal elbow into Jack's face, snapping his head back and breaking his nose. Blood immediately poured down Jack's mouth and chin, choking him. The man pinned him, drawing a heavy serrated combat knife from his chest rig. Jack's vision was failing. The world was dissolving into a dark, pulsing red. He reached out with his left hand, grabbing the wrist, desperately trying to keep the blade away from his throat. It was a losing battle. The point of the knife inched closer, trembling with the sheer force of the downward pressure. Jack reached to his waistband with his right hand. His fingers found the cold, textured grip of Davis's heavy sidearm. He didn't have the strength or the angle to draw it properly and aim. He just wrenched it upward, jamming the barrel directly into the soft, unarmored joint beneath the mercenary's armpit. He pulled the trigger 3 times. The heavy tungsten slugs punched through the undersuit and detonated inside the chest cavity. The mercenary went rigidly stiff, his grip on the knife instantly failing. He collapsed on top of Jack, a dead armored weight. Jack shoved him off with a guttural scream of effort, rolling onto his back. He lay there for a second, staring at the ceiling, gasping for air, choking on his own blood. Beep, beep, beep. The timer on the breaching charge. 10 seconds. Isabella. Jack croaked, trying to push himself up. His arms gave out. The sheer trauma had finally short-circuited his nervous system. He couldn't move. Through the haze, he saw a tall, pale figure standing by the vault keypad. Queen Isabella's hands were trembling violently, her bioluminescent skin flashing a frantic warning red. She was staring at the keypad, paralyzed by the violence she had just witnessed. 8802, enter. Jack coughed, spitting a glob of blood onto his chest. Do it now, she flinched at his voice, but her long fingers danced across the keypad. Access granted with a deep hydraulic groan. The massive vault door began to slide open. Get in, Jack whispered, the darkness finally rushing in to claim his vision. The last thing he saw was the Queen of the Torn Concordat, a being of fragile, untouchable grace stepping toward him instead of the door. She grabbed the collar of his blood-soaked tactical vest and with a surprising desperate strength dragged his limp, dying body across the threshold just as the breaching charge hit 0. Consciousness didn't return all at once. It seeped back in through the cracks, preceded by a symphony of pain. First came the sound, a low, rhythmic thumping that Jack slowly realized was his own heart hammering a desperate, uneven beat against his ribs. Then came the smell, the sharp, acrid tang of vaporized metal from the breaching charge mixed with the heavy copper stench of his own blood. Jack opened his eyes. The world was cast in the dim amber glow of emergency lighting. He was lying flat on his back on a cold plastile floor. He tried to sit up and his body immediately vetoed the decision. A spike of pure white-hot agony shot up his spine, forcing a wet, ragged gasp from his lungs. His right side felt like it had been hollowed out and filled with crushed glass. Do not attempt verticality. Your structural integrity is critically compromised. The voice was mechanical, stripped of inflection by the translation collar, but the physical presence hovering over him was frantic. Jack turned his head. Queen Isabella was kneeling beside him. The matriarch of the 10 Concordat, a being who usually moved with the detached grace of a floating apparition, was covered in his blood. It stained the pristine white silk of her ceremonial robes in stark, terrifying smears. Her pale, translucent hands were trembling violently. She was holding the canister of biofoam he had looted from Davis. You're a mess, Queenie. Jack croaked, the words tasting like pennies. Jack croaked, the words tasting like pennies. Your primary bandage failed during the physical altercation at the threshold, she said. Her large, Molscius-setted eyes were locked onto his midsection. The rigid foam you applied previously fractured. The arterial bleeding resumed. I attempted to replicate your earlier procedure. Jack looked down. His tactical vest was completely unbuckled, his ruined dress shirt torn open. The wound on his right side was a horrific crater of torn flesh, shattered ceramic armor plating, and dark, coagulated blood. But the center of it was filled with a fresh, massive mound of pale, yellow bow foam. It was a terrible, messy application. She had essentially emptied the entire canister into the general vicinity of the hole. But it had worked. The bleeding had stopped. "You did that?" Jack asked, genuine shock cutting through the haze of the fever. For a Tauran to willingly interact with severe biological trauma was unthinkable. Their empathy response was so acute that witnessing gore usually triggered severe nausea, panic attacks, or even localized paralysis. Digging into the open abdominal wound of an alien species to spray a flesh-lessing chemical was the cultural equivalent of a human willingly jumping into an active wood chipper. "I closed my visual receptors," she admitted quietly. "I relied on tactile feedback. It was highly unpleasant. The thermal reaction of the compound burned the outer layer of my epidermis." She held up her left hand. The tips of her long, delicate fingers were scorched red and slightly blistered from handling the volatile biofoam. Jack let out a weak, breathy laugh, which immediately turned into a coughing fit. "Welcome to the infantry, Your Majesty." "You are dying," she stated flatly, ignoring his attempt at humor. The faint blue bioluminescence beneath her skin was barely a flicker. Now the empathic toll of being in the same room as a creature in this much pain was draining her life force. The central neurological shock is cascading. Your body temperature is lethal. I do not understand how your brain is still rendering consciousness." "Spite," Jack muttered, letting his head fall back against the cold floor. "Pure, unadulterated human spite." He scanned their surroundings. They were inside the safe room. It was essentially a 30 by 30 feet plastile cube. No windows, one door. The heavy vault door was sealed shut. The locking mechanisms engaged. The air was stale, heavily filtered. "Did they breach?" he asked. "The vault door possesses a secondary kinetic shield," Isabella answered, settling back onto her heels. "When you triggered the door, the explosive force of their breaching charge deflected outward. The structural integrity of this room remains at 100%. "Good." Jack closed his eyes. The fever was spiking again. The cold plastol beneath him felt incredible against his burning skin. We just have to wait. Diplomatic security protocols. When a summit is attacked, the fleet in orbit drops the hammer. The Marines are coming. We just have to hold out. There's no holding out for you, Jack Riley." Her voice was soft. "Your internal fluid volume is too low. Your organs will starve of oxygen. Even your remarkable biology cannot ignore physics." She wasn't wrong. He couldn't feel his legs anymore. A deep, heavy numbness was creeping up his chest, slowly replacing the pain. It was insidious. It felt like falling asleep after a 30-hour patrol. Easy, inviting. "Keep talking to me," Jack slurred, forcing his eyes open again. The amber emergency lights were starting to blur into long, hazy streaks. "Don't let me fall asleep, Isabella. If I sleep, I don't wake up." She leaned closer. "What shall we converse about?" I have no knowledge of your culture beyond the military statistics our analysts provided. They stated you were a race of violent pragmatists. Dangerous, unrefined. Yeah, well, your analysts are underscore, he whispered. Tell me about Prime. Tell me about your garden. And so she did. As Jack lay bleeding out on the floor of an iron box, the queen of the Turan Concordat painted a picture of a world without sharp edges. She spoke of the singing canyons of Aria where the wind carved melodies into the poorest rock. She described the bioluminescent oceans that mirrored the star charts at night and the towering glasswood forests that hummed with harmonic frequencies. She described a world that had never known a predator, a world that had never needed to invent a sword, let alone a magnetic accelerator rifle. It was beautiful, and it was incredibly fragile. It sounds nice, Jack murmured. The numbness was at his collarbones now. His breathing was incredibly shallow. Every inhale was a conscious, monumental effort. It sounds worth protecting. She stopped speaking. She looked at him, her wide eyes reflecting the dim amber light. We thought you were monsters, she said softly, her mechanical translation collar betraying a sudden deep tremor in her chest. When your delegation arrived, my council voted to reject the alliance. We believed your presence would infect our society. We believed you would bring war to our gardens. Jack tried to smile, but his facial muscles weren't responding. We didn't bring the war, Queenie. The war is already out there. It's the default state of the universe. We're just the guys who know how to build a fence. His vision finally went black. The last thing he felt was the incredibly light, surprisingly cool touch of her blistered fingers resting against his burning forehead. The universe didn't end. It just paused. Jack was dragged back into the realm of the living by a violent, concussive jolt that rattled his teeth. His eyes snapped open, but he couldn't see anything. Dust and pulverized concrete choked the air. Boom! Another jolt. The floor vibrated beneath him. Stand clear! A muffled, synthesized voice roared through the heavy blast. It wasn't the mechanical click of the mercenaries' comms. It was a heavy booming PA system of human power armor. Jack couldn't move, but he managed to turn his head a fraction of an inch. Isabella was huddled in the corner, her arms wrapped around her knees. Boom! The 2 feet thick, solid tungsten vault door didn't slide open. It was blown completely off its tracks. The massive slab of metal screamed as it was torn from its hinges, crashing onto the floor of the safe room with a localized earthquake that shook the dust from the ceiling. Through the billowing smoke, towering figures emerged. They wore heavy, deep green orbital drop armor. The shoulders bore the insignia of the United Earth Directorate, the 4th Marine Expeditionary Unit. A massive figure stepped through the breach, his helmet flood lights cutting through the dust. He swept the room with a heavy plasma repeater, the weapon humming with lethal intent. Clear, he barked. 2 more Marines filed in behind him. The leader's floodlights swept over Jack, then snapped to Queen Isabella. The Marine lowered his weapon instantly. Package secured, the Marine announced over his external comms. He reached up, unsealing his helmet. A rush of pressurized air hissed as he pulled it off. It was Captain Reynolds. Jack recognized his scarred jawline and close-cropped gray hair. He looked at Isabella, taking in the blood-soaked ruin of her ceremonial robes. Then he looked down at Jack. "Christ almighty," Reynolds muttered, taking a knee beside him. He didn't flinch at the gore. He didn't hesitate. He ripped a heavy medical scanner from his hip and ran it over Jack's chest. The scanner immediately began screaming a high-pitched, erratic warning alarm. "Doc, get your ass in here. I need a trauma team now." Reynolds roared over his shoulder. A combat medic in lighter armor pushed past the heavy infantry, dropping a massive medical kit beside Jack. He took one look at the massive pile of scorched foam in his side and whistled. "Who did the patch job?" the medic asked, his hands flying over Jack's chest, attaching vital monitors. "I did," a quiet voice answered. The medic looked up. Captain Reynolds looked up. Queen Isabella stood slowly. She looked utterly diminished. Her robes were ruined. Her hands were blistered. The pale glow of her skin was entirely extinguished, leaving her looking like a marble statue covered in a butcher's handiwork. "He sustained catastrophic kinetic trauma protecting my person," Isabella said, her translation collar echoing in the sudden silence of the room. "He utilized a corrosive compound to halt his own biological functions from failing. When that failed, I replicated the process." Reynolds stared at her, then looked back down at Jack. A tight, grim smile pulled at the corner of his mouth. "You made the alien royalty play combat medic, Riley. You're going to be writing incident reports until you retire." "Tell him to put it on my tab, sir." Jack managed a rasp, a bloody bubble popping on his lips. "Shut up, Marine. Save your breath." The medic snapped. "Heart rate is dropping. BP is non-existent. We need him in a tank 10 minutes ago. Prep a grab stretcher." 2 more Marines rushed in with a hovering medical litter. They didn't gently lift him. There was no time for that. They grabbed Jack's tactical harness and hauled him onto the stretcher in one smooth, brutal motion. The pain was astronomical. A supernova in his side that finally mercifully tripped the final breaker in his brain. As the darkness took him for the second time, Jack heard Isabella's voice, not filtered through the flat, mechanical translation collar, but echoing in its own natural harmonic frequency. It was a beautiful, sorrowful sound. "Do not let him cease, please." The United Earth director at Hospital Ship Aegis smelled like bleach, ozone, and synthetically recycled air. It was a smell Jack had woken up to more times than he cared to admit. He opened his eyes. There was no amber emergency light, just the harsh, bright fluorescence of a sterile medical bay. He was floating. Of a sterile medical bay. He was floating. Jack looked down. He was suspended in a zero-gravity regenerative matrix tank. The pale green fluid felt like warm gel against his skin. He tried to move his right arm, and a thick tangle of intravenous tubes restricted his motion. He looked at his right side. The gaping hole was gone. In its place was a massive, angry expanse of shiny pink, newly grown flesh. It looked like a terrible burn scar stretching from his floating rib down to his hip bone. They had regrown the muscle and the skin, but they hadn't been able to make it pretty. It adds character, don't you think? Jack turned his head. Ambassador Carter was standing on the other side of the tank's observation glass. He was a distinguished man in his 60s wearing a sharp, dark suit. He tapped a command onto a console, and the fluid slowly drained from the tank. The gravity plating slowly re-engaged. Jack felt his weight return, settling him gently onto the padded medical bed, at the bottom of the enclosure. The glass shield hissed and slid upward. "How long?" Jack asked. His voice sounded weak, but it didn't hurt to speak. The air in his lungs felt clear. 3 weeks, Carter replied, stepping into the enclosure and handing him a hospital gown. "You flatlined twice on the shuttle ride up. The surgeon spent 14 hours reconstructing your abdominal wall. They had to replace your right kidney with a synthetic one, and your lower intestine is mostly lab-grown tissue now." Jack pulled the gown over his head, grimacing as the fabric brushed against a fresh, sensitive scar tissue. "Do I get a medal or just a bill for the new parts?" Carter smiled faintly. "You get a promotion, Gunnery Sergeant Riley, and you get a permanent, very specific notation in your file." "What kind of notation?" "The kind that says you single-handedly altered the geopolitical landscape of the Orion Spur." Carter pulled up a chair and sat down. He looked exhausted but deeply satisfied. The mercenaries were hired by a radical isolationist faction within the Tehran Concordat. They wanted to kill the Queen and frame us to permanently derail the treaty. "Did it work?" Carter chuckled. "Jack, you bled all over their supreme matriarch. You shoved a canister of corrosive chemicals into your own body, killed 4 armored commandos with stolen weapons, and then talked the Queen through a severe panic attack while actively dying." He leaned forward. "The Tehrans don't understand us. They still think we're barbaric, loud, and needlessly violent, but they no longer think we're a threat to them. They realize we are a threat to everything else." The door to the medical bay hissed open. Carter stood up immediately, smoothing his suit jacket. Queen Isabella walked in. She wasn't wearing her ceremonial robes. She wore a simple, elegant garment of spun silver threads. Her skin was glowing with a healthy, vibrant, pulsing blue light. She looked radiant. But as she approached the bed, Jack noticed she wore thin silk gloves over her hands to hide the burn scars. "Ambassador," she acknowledged Carter with a slight nod. "Your Majesty, I will leave you to it," Carter said respectfully, bowing slightly before exiting the room. Isabella stood beside the bed, looking down at Jack. She studied the monitors, the tubes, and finally his face. "You are vertical," she observed. "More horizontal at the moment, Queenie, but I'm getting there," he replied, offering a weak smile. She reached out, her gloved hand resting gently against the edge of his bed. "The treaty was signed yesterday. The Sovereign Assembly has officially entered a mutual defense pact with the United Earth Directorate. Glad to hear my kidney didn't die in vain." She didn't laugh. She looked incredibly serious. "My council argued against it even after the attack. They argued that bringing humans into our borders would invite violence. They said, 'Your kind draws conflict, like gravity draws mass.' They aren't entirely wrong," Jack admitted softly. "I told them," Isabella continued, her voice taking on a firm, unyielding tone that he hadn't heard before, "that they were fools. I told them that a garden without a wall is just a feeding ground. And I told them that I had seen what humans do when the wolves come." She looked directly into his eyes, and for the first time the cultural barrier between them felt entirely absent. There was no revulsion, no confusion, just absolute, profound respect. "You did not surrender to the pain, Jack Riley. You weaponized it for my survival. My species will never understand your biology. We will never understand your culture, but we understand your scars." She reached out, and with a slow, deliberate motion, she placed her gloved hand directly over the thick, angry pink scar on his right side. She didn't flinch. "We are honored to have you stand before our gates," she whispered. Jack looked at her, then down at her hand resting on his ruined side. He thought about the mud, the blood, and the centuries of human warfare that had bred humanity into the stubborn, unyielding creatures they were. They weren't pretty. They weren't graceful. But when the universe demanded blood, they were the only ones willing to bleed. "Just make sure you guys keep the flowers blooming, Queenie," Jack said quietly. "We'll handle the rest." If you enjoyed this visceral dive into human resilience and the gritty reality of HFY Sci-Fi, hit that like button and subscribe for more epic, adrenaline-fueled stories from across the galaxy. Don't forget to share this video with your fellow sci-fi fans who love seeing humanity defy the odds. Drop a comment below. What did you think of Jack's brutal biofoam patch job? Would you have survived the vault? Let me know your thoughts and stay tuned for the next transmission from the Outer Rim.